She thought she could manipulate everyone until her betrayal was exposed. Ben, Lewis, and Derek already knew the truth, and now they were determined to teach her what it feels like to be the victim. Her manipulations no longer had any power. But is she ready for real revenge? This is not the end. It's just the beginning. What happens next? You can't miss this. Lewis woke up with a strange feeling. Something made him open his eyes. The bedroom was dark, but he immediately noticed the soft glow of a screen on the nightstand next to his wife. Jenny's phone lit up again. Lewis involuntarily glanced at the screen. I miss you. When's the next night? The sender, a contact named Ben. Lewis froze. His fingers gripped the blanket tightly. He didn't want to believe the worst, but his heart started pounding in his chest. Was it a joke? Spam? A stupid coincidence? His wife was peacefully sleeping beside him. Her breathing was steady, her face relaxed, as if there were no secrets in her life. He couldn't just fall asleep again. His gaze fell on the phone once more. No, this was nonsense. She would never do something like that. He closed his eyes, trying to push the intrusive thoughts away. In the morning, everything would fall into place. Jenny behaved as usual. She kissed Lewis on the cheek, grabbed her gym bag, and said she was going to the gym. Aren't you having breakfast? No, I'm not hungry. I'll eat something later. She smiled and left without even looking him in the eye. Lewis waited a few minutes, then went to the bedroom. His stomach clenched. He knew it was wrong, but the thought of losing his wife felt even worse. He took Jenny's phone. His hands trembled slightly as he typed in the password, their son's birthday. The screen unlocked. The message from Ben wasn't the only one. Tony, last night was amazing. I can still smell you. Derek, see you on Friday. Hope your husband doesn't suspect anything. Lewis felt the blood drain from his face. She wasn't just cheating on him. She was living a double life. No, a triple life. His wife was seeing 3 different men. He stood in the bedroom, gripping the phone, trying to steady his breath. He wanted to throw it away, smash it against the wall, but he forced himself to calm down. Sudden anger shifted to cold calculation. He wouldn't ask. He wouldn't cause a scene. Instead, he decided to find out everything about them. The first name, Ben. From the messages, it was clear that he worked at the gym Jenny went to 3 times a week. Lewis signed up there the next day. He hadn't worked out in years, but that didn't matter now. He needed to see Ben. The gym was modern, with expensive equipment and mirrors on the walls. Lewis walked into the locker room, changed into his workout clothes, and went out into the gym. His gaze immediately locked on a tall, muscular man near the treadmills. Ben was one of the trainers, tanned, confident, with a perfect smile. He was laughing, flirting with female clients, lightly touching their arms. Lewis clenched his fists. He imagined Jenny touching this man, laughing in his arms. He was overwhelmed with the urge to walk over and punch Ben right in the face. But instead, he took a deep breath and walked to the registration desk. I'm new here. I need a trainer. We have a few available, the receptionist said. Ben, for example. Perfect. The first training session was intense. Lewis wasn't listening to the explanations or focusing on the technique. His mind was focused only on one thing: how to make this man talk. So, you're new here? Ben asked as Lewis put down the dumbbells. Yeah, decided to get in shape. Ben smiled. All right. Why now? Lewis paused. Personal reasons. Ben nodded, unaware. Lewis spent 2 hours in the gym, observing every move Ben made. From the trainer's conversations with clients, he learned that Ben lived alone, loved fast cars, and frequently visited nightclubs. A few more conversations, and Ben would crack. Next on the list was Tony. Lewis found him through social media. Tony worked at a restaurant where Jenny often had lunch with her friends. Lewis went there that evening. The restaurant was small, cozy, with soft lighting and quiet music. Lewis sat at a table near the bar and looked around. Tony worked as a waiter. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, playful eyes. He winked at customers, leaned over tables, and flirted. Again, Lewis felt that same pain in his chest. Jenny slept with him. Lewis ordered dinner and began observing. When Tony brought his steak, Lewis looked him straight in the eye. Have you worked here long? Tony smiled. About a year. Do you like it here? Yes. Lewis paused. My wife often comes here. Jenny. He watched his reaction. Tony tensed for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. Oh, yes. She's a wonderful woman. Lewis nodded. He knew Tony was hiding something, and he would find out what it was. Last was Derek. Lewis didn't know who he was or what he did yet, but it was only a matter of time. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was sure of one thing. He wasn't just going to expose Ginny. He was going to make her regret every step she took. Louis left the restaurant, his mind swirling with thoughts. He saw it in Tony's expression. He knew who Ginny was. And he clearly didn't expect her husband to show up, sit at a table, and look him straight in the eye. Louis took out his phone and opened his wife's contact list. Derek. The number was there, but without a photo or any information. He decided to do things differently. He went home and opened his laptop. Hacking into her email was easy. He knew all her passwords. Inbox, deleted messages, search history. Among the messages from the bank, stores, and friends, he found an email with the subject, booking confirmed. He opened it. Palm Grove Hotel. Date, last Saturday. 2 guests. Name, Derek Stevenson. His breath quickened. Last Saturday, Ginny had said she was going to her mother's. She was lying. Louis typed the name into the search. Derek Stevenson worked in real estate. He owned several nightclubs, was wealthy, successful, and loved loud parties. He found his photo. A man with graying hair, a fancy suit, and a confident smile. Louis felt something boil inside him. Ginny was seeing someone like him. The next day, Louis went to Derek's office. He had no plan. He just wanted to see this man in person. A tall office building with tinted windows. He sat in the car, waiting. At 1 p.m., Derek emerged. He wasn't alone. A stunning brunette in a red dress held his hand. She was laughing, and Derek whispered something in her ear. They got into a black Mercedes and drove away. Louis watched. It changed everything. He didn't talk about it with Ginny. She came home as usual, kissed him on the cheek, and went to take a shower. Louis sat in the kitchen, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hands. His wife had slept with 3 men, but one of them, he himself, had cheated on her. Derek had another woman. Louis took a sip. This was the chance. If he found the right approach, Derek could become his ally. The next day, he waited by the office again. At 3 o'clock, Derek came out alone. Louis got out of the car. Derek Stevenson? He stopped and gave him a measuring look. Yes. How can I help you? Louis walked up closer. I'm Louis, Ginny's husband. A barely noticeable shift appeared on Derek's face. He remained calm, but his fingers tightened around his car keys. And what do you need? I know about you. Silence. Louis looked him straight in the eye. But what's more interesting is, does your wife know about her? Derek exhaled slowly. Let's walk. They walked down the street, avoiding curious glances. I'm not the only one on this list, am I? Derek said when they stopped by a cafe. Louis smiled. Tony and Ben. Derek laughed. So she wasn't just playing. She was creating a theater. Louis nodded. Derek leaned back against the wall, lost in thought. What do you want? Revenge. Derek raised an eyebrow. Specifically. Louis felt something dark and cold stir inside him. Let's meet with them. Derek stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he smiled. Damn, this is going to be interesting. Louis didn't expect everything to go so smoothly. Derek was a man of action. He had many connections and quickly contacted Tony and Ben. Ben didn't immediately agree to the meeting, but when he heard it concerned Ginny, he showed up without hesitation. They gathered in a private room at one of Derek's clubs. Tony arrived first. He looked calm, but his eyes were alert. Ben came last. He glanced at Louis, then at the other men. What the hell is this? Derek gestured for him to sit. We're all here for the same reason. Ben glanced at Tony. You too. Tony nodded. Ben laughed nervously. So she's been leading us all on. Louis leaned forward. This is just the beginning. The 3 of them looked at him. Louis smiled. I have a plan. He told them everything. They listened in silence. When he finished, Derek nodded. Let's do this. Tony clenched his fists. I'm in. Ben wiped his palms on his jeans. Damn it. Me too. Louis leaned back. Ginny had no idea what was coming for her. He felt a rush of adrenaline. He looked at the 3 men, who just the day before had no idea about each other, but now sat at the same table, united by one goal. Ginny had played them, divided her life between them, but now it was her turn to feel what it meant to be deceived. What do you suggest? Tony asked, leaning over the table. Louis took a sip of whiskey, slowly set the glass down. We won't fight with her. No scenes. We'll make her fall into her own trap. Ben frowned. How exactly? Louis pulled out his phone and opened Ginny's contacts list. She thinks she controls the situation. But if we show her that her secrets are no longer under her control, she'll break. Derek smiled. I like this. Lewis pressed call and put the phone to his ear. "Hi, babe," he said when Jenny answered. "How about a romantic dinner tonight?" He saw knowing smiles appear on the faces of the men. Jenny didn't know this would be her last peaceful night. Lewis prepared dinner. Candles, wine, the perfect picture of domestic comfort. Jenny returned home in a good mood, kicked off her heels, and hugged her husband. "This is a surprise," she said, sitting at the table. "I just wanted to spend time with you," Lewis smiled, pouring the wine. They talked about everything and nothing. Jenny joked, talked about her friends, and workouts. She had no idea that every word she said was another drop in the cup of lies. When they finished the wine, Lewis leaned in closer. "You know," he said softly, "I want to give you a surprise." Jenny raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind?" Lewis pulled out his phone, opened a message, and slowly placed it in front of her. "Guess who this is?" A message appeared on the screen. "I can't wait to meet you. I'll tell him it's my bachelorette party. Love you. Cinder, Derek." Jenny turned pale. Lewis watched as she tried to pull herself together. "It's not what you think," she began, but he raised his hand. "Don't bother, Jenny. I know everything." He pulled out another phone, her second one, the one she had hidden in the car. "Ben, Tony, Derek. Did I forget anyone?" She stayed silent. Lewis waited for her to speak, for her to try and explain, but Jenny just looked at him. And then, she smiled. "Well, you found out." He hadn't expected this. "Don't you even feel sorry?" "Should I?" She laughed, leaning back in her chair. "You know our marriage has been dead for a long time." Lewis clenched his fists. "If that's the case, why did you stay?" Jenny leaned in closer. "Because it was convenient." He felt something snap inside him. She felt no remorse, no fear. Only pleasure. Lewis stood up. "This is your last night here." Jenny didn't flinch. "Oh, Lewis." She smiled. "You really think I lied to you more than anyone else?" He froze. "What do you mean?" Jenny slowly pulled out her phone, opened the gallery, and placed it in front of him. A photo. Her. With Derek. And another man. Lewis squinted, trying to make it out. And then his heart stopped. It was Tony. They were together. Jenny smiled. "I know what you were about to do. But you have no idea how far this goes." Lewis couldn't believe what he was seeing. She had betrayed not only him. She had betrayed them all. Lewis stared at the photo, feeling his thoughts break into chaotic pieces. Jenny looked at him calmly, almost enjoying the moment. She wasn't nervous, didn't offer any excuses. She was just waiting for his reaction. Lewis raised his gaze, his throat dry. "What does this mean?" "It means you played your game, and I played mine," she replied with a barely noticeable smile. Lewis looked again at the screen. Derek and Tony. He understood that she had been fooling them all, just like she had fooled him, but this photo changed everything. "You were seeing them at the same time?" "Of course," she said calmly, lifting her glass and taking a sip. "You didn't think I'd be faithful to any of you, did you?" Lewis clenched his fists, feeling rage boil inside him. He had been sure he controlled the situation, that he and the other men had cornered her. But now it was clear, Jenny was one step ahead. "How long?" he barely managed to ask. "Long enough to realize they're not that special," she glanced at him. "You thought you brought them together against me. Now imagine what will happen when they find out about this." Lewis felt his stomach tighten. He could already picture Derek's and Tony's faces when they found out not only had she been lying to them, but they had shared her between themselves. And Ben? Was he part of this too? "Why are you showing this to me?" Jenny tilted her head, thoughtfully tapping her fingers on the table. "Because I know you want revenge. And I want to see how exactly you're going to do it." He didn't answer. "You're smart, Lewis," her voice was almost gentle. "But you don't know how to play these games. You're trying to fight for justice, but in this world, only those who accept the rules survive." He felt his jaw tighten. She had been playing with him. Still playing with him. "And what do you suggest?" She smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Let's make this more interesting. You're not just going to leave me, are you?" Lewis remained silent. "Think about it." She stood up, grabbed her phone, and walked toward the bedroom. "You won't leave me anyway." He wanted to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He stayed in the kitchen, staring at the photo. Derek, Tony, and her between them. The next day, Lewis went to the club where he had met Derek, Ben, and Tony. They were all waiting for him, sitting at the same table as last time. "Anything new?" Derek asked, swallowing a sip of whiskey. Lewis pulled out his phone, opened the photo, and threw it on the table. They leaned over the screen. Tony recoiled first. "What the hell?" Derek silently stared at the image, his fingers clenching into a fist. Is this a joke? No joke, Lewis replied. Ben took the phone, examining the details. His face changed. So, she was with both of you? And with me, Lewis quietly added. A silence fell in the room. She's been playing us all, muttered Tony. Damn, I thought we had something real. Derek snorted. Hello, buddy. There are 4 idiots here. Lewis watched as their anger boiled up, as they tried to comprehend the situation. So what do you suggest? Derek asked, his voice tense. Lewis took a deep breath. She thinks she controls the situation, that we won't be able to outsmart her. Tony hummed. And? Lewis looked at them. We're going to make her feel what real betrayal is. Ben narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? Lewis leaned back in his chair. We'll find her weak spot. Derek smiled. I'm starting to like this. Tony looked at him. Do you have a plan? Lewis nodded slowly. She's betrayed all of us. But there's one person she trusts more than anyone else. The 3 of them stared at him. Who? Lewis smiled. You have no idea how tangled everything is. He picked up his phone, opened another photo, and placed it on the table. Jenny. And another man. Lewis knew they wouldn't be ready for this. He knew it would change everything. Lewis saw their expressions shift from anger to confusion. They couldn't grasp who else Jenny had involved in her games. Derek was the first to grab the phone and lean closer. Tony stood up, stared at the photo, then shifted his gaze to Lewis. Is this a joke? His voice sounded tense. I wish it were, Lewis replied calmly, though inside, his anger was tearing him apart. In the photo, Jenny was kissing a man in a place familiar to Lewis, their living room. The man standing next to her had his arm around her waist. His face was partially obscured, but Lewis would recognize him even in the dark. Ben, Derek said quietly, and all eyes turned to him. Ben sat still, his eyes fixed on the phone, his jaw clenched as if he was trying to swallow something bitter. He inhaled sharply, lifted his head, and looked at Lewis. It's fake. Lewis shook his head slowly. I don't think so. Tony snatched the phone from Derek's hands, looked at the photo again, then tossed it onto the table. So, she betrayed all of us, and also you, Ben. Derek grimaced. So she was messing around with all 4 of us, but you 2 got a surprise? Ben swallowed hard. This is nonsense. Doesn't look like it, Lewis retorted. Ben was silent, his fingers running over his knees, then he leaned back, giving a crooked smile. Damn, Tony snorted. So that's why you were always dodging when we talked about her. You thought she was only yours, huh? Ben nervously ran his hands over his face, then stood up abruptly. I didn't know she was sleeping with all of you. Lewis looked at him emotionlessly. But you knew she was married. Ben didn't answer, just ran his palm over the back of his neck. So what now? You want me to join your plan too? Derek crossed his arms over his chest. What, do you have any alternatives? Tony threw a napkin on the table, hummed. You want her to pay for everything too? Ben frowned, but didn't object. Lewis paused, glancing at each of them. I've got an idea. Tony crossed his arms. I'm listening. Lewis slowly raised his phone and opened the chat with Jenny. She doesn't know that we've figured everything out. She thinks she controls the situation. Derek nodded. Go on. Lewis leaned in closer. We all meet with her at different times. She thinks she can keep us separate. Let's bring her together at one time in one place. Tony narrowed his eyes. Force her to see us all at once? Exactly. Derek smiled. I like it. Ben clenched his fists, his eyes darkening with anger. And how are we supposed to do that? Lewis leaned back. She won't say no if all of you invite her out on the same night. Tony whistled. Damn, this is going to be a show. Ben glanced at Lewis. And what will you be doing? Lewis smiled. I'll wait until she figures it all out. Over the next few days, they followed the plan. Tony was the first to text her, asking to meet at a restaurant downtown. She quickly agreed. Then Derek invited her at the same time, but to a bar across the street. She didn't refuse. Ben arranged to meet her at a hotel. When the day arrived, all 3 of them waited. Lewis watched from the car as Jenny arrived. She looked flawless, a tight black dress, expensive shoes, carefree smile. She entered the restaurant where Tony was supposed to be. 10 minutes passed. Jenny walked out, her face tense. She quickly typed something into her phone. She crossed the street and entered the bar where Derek was waiting. Another 5 minutes passed. Lewis saw her leave the bar, now clearly confused. She checked her phone, glanced at the hotel. Ben was no longer waiting for her there. She began to understand. Lewis got out of the car and slowly walked toward her. Jenny stopped when she saw him. He smiled. Having a nice evening, darling? Her lips pressed together, and she took a step back. It's you. No, it's all of us. Derek's voice came from behind. She turned, and Tony stepped out from the crowd. Ben was also standing nearby, arms crossed. She was surrounded. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. Lewis leaned in closer. How does it feel when your game is over? She looked at them all, her breath shaky. This isn't what you think. Tony laughed. Oh, darling, we know exactly what it is. Ben crossed his arms. What now? Lewis stared directly into her eyes. Now, Ginny, you'll know what it feels like to be betrayed. She tried to take another step back, but bumped into a wall. She was trapped. Derek leaned in close. And believe me, this is just the beginning. Ginny stood still, her gaze empty, her heart pounding wildly. She tried to gather her thoughts, but every word she had planned to say seemed meaningless. The men stood around her, their eyes filled with disappointment and contempt. She felt like her world was falling apart. Now what? Her voice trembled, but she tried to stay strong. They all stared at her, waiting for a response, but said nothing. Only Lewis leaned in closer and smiled. Now you'll know what it's like to be on the other side. You'll understand what it's like when people trust you, and then you betray them. His words were sharp and piercing, like the blades of a knife. Ginny wanted to reply, but the words wouldn't come out. She felt her throat tighten, and her eyes filled with tears. She tried to approach one of them, hoping someone would forgive her, but they all stepped back. Where's your confidence now, Ginny? Tony asked, looking at her with disappointment. You were always the one in control, and now? Now you're trapped. Ginny gritted her teeth, trying to hold herself together. She couldn't believe what was happening. How had this come to be? How did she end up in this situation? I had no choice, she whispered. I needed all of you to have control over my life. Control? Derek asked, ignoring her attempts to explain. So you decided manipulating people was the only way to control your life? And how did that work out, Ginny? Don't you realize we all know about your affairs? She didn't answer, only stared at them, realizing her time was up. She was lost. Don't you understand? Ben said, remaining calm, though his eyes burned with anger. You thought you could live in two worlds, but now you're stuck between them. Did you feel what we felt? She lowered her head, too exhausted to respond. Lewis nodded, signaling that everything had been said. But that's not all, Lewis added, his expression serious. Now you'll have to pay for your mistakes. Tony stepped out of the crowd and quietly said, Ginny, paint yourself a new reality, because the one you had is over. We'll wait a little while, Derek added, taking out his phone. We'll show you how easily you were deceived. Ginny froze, feeling her heart clench in her chest. What does this mean? What do they want to do with her? Is this her last chance to escape? She took a few steps back, hoping to find an exit, but saw how they had blocked every possible escape route. Now, there was nowhere to go. Do you still think you have a choice? Ben said bitterly. Now the choice is ours. And we've decided you will pay. It will be enough just to see how you understand that we're human too, Tony added. What do you want from me? Ginny asked, her voice no longer confident, but broken. This will be a lesson for you, Lewis replied. You'll learn to trust people. And you'll realize that not everyone around you is just a pawn for your manipulation. Ginny felt her legs give way. She didn't know what to do. All her manipulations, all her tricks, all her thoughts of control, everything became meaningless. She understood that her betrayal wasn't only to Ben, but also to herself. Do you want to destroy me? She whispered, trying to find some hope for salvation. No, Lewis said, his tone softening. We don't want to destroy you. We want you to understand. That's all. And at that moment, as she stood powerless, all three men took a step forward. Her heart raced faster, her breath becoming heavy, but she already knew she could no longer compete with reality. Tony leaned towards her, smiling. This is not the end. This is only the beginning, he said, and a sinister expression crossed his face. It was then that Ginny realized it wasn't over. Her true reckoning was just beginning. Ginny stood there, her whole world collapsing. She looked at the men, their gazes cold and disappointed. She felt her own body betraying her, emotions mixing into chaos. All her manipulations, all her tricks, they now seemed so childish and pathetic. Her paths were blocked, and she didn't know how to escape. But I didn't see it all this way. Ginny's voice trembled, but she still tried to maintain some dignity. Lewis walked toward her, his face showing no emotion, only the cold understanding that her time had come. Don't try to justify yourself anymore, Ginny. You've already ruined everything. And now you need to understand that we have a right to our sense of justice too. Tony nodded in agreement. They all knew she wouldn't have any chance of justification. But you just want to crush me? She asked, her gaze filled with confusion and despair. We want you to understand that this isn't just revenge, Derek said. This is a lesson. You've been lying, manipulating people, betraying. Now it's your turn to learn what it feels like when you're the one being betrayed. Her heart was pounding wildly. She felt despair taking over, but suddenly her gaze landed on Ben. She knew he had been suffering all this time. His face was calm, but inside, he was burning with anger. He had been a part of this game too, and now he was ready to finish it. Ben, please, please. Her voice trembled. She didn't want to lose him. He had been everything to her, but now there was nowhere to turn. This is your game, Jenny, and now you've lost, he replied, his expression unchanged. You were willing to walk over others to achieve your goals. Now look at what's left. Jenny looked at his firm face and felt her heart breaking. But there was no time for tears, it was already decided. They didn't plan to just leave her to her fate. You're not going anywhere, Jenny. Lewis stepped closer and spoke coldly but clearly. You're staying here, and we'll show you what happens when you betray trust. They surrounded her, and her breath became heavier. She began to realize that her choices had long been over. All her manipulations, all her attempts to escape reality, they didn't matter. She was just part of their plan. And suddenly, when she was ready to collapse to her knees and accept her fate, Ben stepped forward. No, Jenny. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet but ominous. You won't find peace. You need to understand the consequences of your actions. And at that moment, when she thought everything had been decided, Lewis looked at everyone and clenched his fists. No, it's not over yet, Jenny. Now you see what real control means. Real triumph. And then, as she stood there, realizing her life had changed forever, her gaze fell on one of the phones lying on the table. It was on. It seemed someone had been recording everything. This is not the end, Tony said. This is just the beginning of your real lesson. Was it fair that you decided to unite against Jenny, or was it more of a desired revenge for her betrayal?